To understand the menstrual cycle, we need to first think about the different components of the hypothalamo-pituitary ovarian axis and think about the hormones involved. So we have the hypothalamus, we have the pituitary, we have the ovaries, and they all communicate with each other, and there's a lot of feedback going on. So I'm going to try and simplify it as much as possible. So in this diagram, green is going to be a positive influence, that is basically increasing the production of various hormones from these three different parts of the axis, and red is going to be an inhibitory effect. So first of all, the hypothalamus releases gonadotrophin-releasing hormone, GnRH, which stimulates the pituitary to produce LH and FSH. This then acts on the ovaries, leads to the development of follicles, and essentially drives much of the menstrual cycle. We then have a bunch of feedback effects going on. So this is a very crucial point. So low levels of estrogen has a negative feedback effect on the pituitary gland. However, after it reaches a critical threshold, the effect of the estrogen essentially flips over, and it becomes a positive effect on the hypothalamus, leading to a surge in GnRH and hence a surge in LH and FSH. Low progesterone has a positive feedback effect on the pituitary gland, whereas high progesterone inhibits the pituitary gland. So this is the important thing about the menstrual cycle and the hormonal interplays, because it isn't quite as simple as some hormones are positive, some hormones are negative in terms of their feedback. It does actually depend on the relative concentrations of the hormones. High progesterone also has a negative impact on the hypothalamus. So all of that can be a little bit confusing, but the key point to take home is that the effect of estrogen on pituitary hormones will switch once the concentration reaches this critical threshold. So do keep that in mind. So this is the diagram that everyone has seen at some point, showing how the hormone levels change during a cycle. So the x-axis is showing a 28-day cycle, and the LH peak that you see will be around 14 days, which is when you would normally expect ovulation to happen. This is quite difficult to interpret much of the time, but I feel like it's a little bit easier when you think about what's happening in the endometrium as well whilst these changes are occurring. So what I've shown in the bottom diagram is essentially how the endometrium changes. So it begins at the onset of menstruation, where the endometrium thins and then eventually builds up until the end of the menstrual cycle, which is basically when the corpus luteum runs out of progesterone. So the menstrual cycle is divided into the follicular phase and the luteal phase. So during the follicular phase, we have LH and FSH stimulating the growth of a follicle, and then the follicle will be producing some estrogen as well. So the estrogen levels will gradually increase over time, and remember that initially low levels of estrogen will have a negative feedback effect on LH and FSH. So those levels will actually decrease slightly during this phase. However, eventually the estrogen concentration reaches a critical threshold, at which point it then has a positive feedback effect. And this causes a surge in LH and FSH, but the surge in LH is considerably bigger. And it is this surge in LH that actually triggers ovulation. After ovulation, we have the luteal phase, and this is where the follicle that has just released its egg becomes the corpus luteum, and this produces progesterone. And the point of the progesterone is to maintain the thickness of the endometrium and hence make it a hospitable environment for implantation. Eventually, if fertilization hasn't happened within this roughly 14-day window, the corpus luteum essentially runs out of the capability to produce progesterone, and hence the drop in progesterone leads to breakdown of the endometrial lining. So again, that is a little bit convoluted, but I'm going to try and summarize it into just a few points. The point of estrogen is that it builds up the endometrium. Progesterone then maintains the endometrium to try and optimize conditions for implantation. The LH surge, triggered by the change in the feedback effect of estrogen on the axis, leads to ovulation. And the corpus luteum produces progesterone for about 14 days before it runs out of steam, and then the drop in progesterone leads to shedding of the endometrium.